I will touch upon the issues of public participation in a Greenlandic context. Why is public participation necessary? Why does it matter? And I will address the current primary public participation form here in Greenland, its limitations, and some of the first steps for how we might improve the process and create engagement that makes sense to all stakeholders and create more sustainable decisions. Now, as Nadia presented so nicely, we are all aware that Greenland has come in the global spotlight in recent years due to the changing climate, its strategic position at the heart of the Arctic, and its richness in, among other, rare earth metals, iron, gold, and the oil potential. We all know of Greenland's high hopes to develop the extractive sector to gain new sources of income, to gain economic independence. We also know that to date there has been no commercially viable oil find, as Nadia told us, and only a few minor mineral projects have been implemented. Nonetheless, research shows that, among others, that just the mere expectations of the initiation of a project can have an impact on society. So projects that are never even implemented can have an effect. And the activities in the mineral and petroleum sector have already caused great societal changes in Greenland. Now, there are many factors at play in the development of the extractive industry, and many uncertainties as well. And some of the major benefits of public participation is, if it's done properly, that it can promote resilience in local communities and give people a fair chance to manage these uncertainties and adapt to change. So, yeah, you can still hear my breathing, but this is Malik and Evie. And public participation, in my view, is particularly relevant for these two guys. They represent the younger generation in Greenland, the population group most likely to experience the greatest impacts of the extractive development. Now, they are often mentioned in discourses on the future development of Greenland, where great responsibility is placed on their shoulders. They are the bearers of hope for a prospecting future. And there's great emphasis on having local content in projects and activities in the extractive sector. Yet, they are not emphasized in the formal guidelines when it comes to impact assessment in relation to mineral and petroleum activities. And they hardly appear in the current PP process either. Reports show that only 6% of the younger generation of Greenlanders have attended a public consultation meeting on mineral and petroleum activities. In fact, only 20% of the Greenlandic population in general have attended such meetings. Further, the majority of these 20% are male of the elder generation. So I want you to think just for a moment about these numbers, because I think they're rather thought-provoking. Now, we all know, as Rachel said, we can all do better, and I think we can. The numbers highly questions whether the current PP process is supporting democracy in Greenland, whether it provides useful knowledge for making good decisions, sustainable decisions, and whether the current methods can be used to facilitate active and meaningful engagement. At current, the public participation form does not facilitate a representative voice of the public in Greenland, leaving many stakeholders frustrated without a sense of their voices being heard. So perhaps the following that I present can serve as input to reach out to more stakeholders, as Nadia expressed they would like to do in the upcoming mineral and petroleum strategy. To foster sustainable development, we need representative voices. We also need to hear about the values, the hopes and fears of the youth. How do they see their future? We need the youth perspective on the extractive development if we are to facilitate sustainable decisions. And to get that, we need to think differently about how public participation is conducted in Greenland today. But how do we do that? How do we create active and meaningful engagement? I think that a good place to start would be in how we think about public participation. We need to change the general perceptions of public engagement. That includes its purpose, the methods used, how we can create a good balance between the very different stakeholder expectations. There's a need to be aware that public participation is more than just a means to an end. It's more than just a tick in the box. If public participation is done well, it does have the potential to benefit all stakeholders involved in the project. And we should focus on the more collaborative approaches, supporting dialogue and mutual learning. So, approaches and methods should be adapted with concern for the specific project, target group, and setting to enable a broader representative voice. For this, I have an example, which is my research on youth engagement here. What you see on this slide are some of the input that I've collected from Greenlandic youth in an engagement project called the Photo Forum Project. This is a project where I combined the use of Facebook, the social media most applied here in Greenland by the young generation, and photos. The young participants, they were joined together in a closed Facebook group for 4 weeks, and they had volunteers to provide input on their values, hopes and dreams, fears and concerns, and their view on the extractive development here in Greenland. And one of the advantages that I found using these tools was that, for instance, Facebook made it possible to overcome the typical challenges of logistics, timing, and costs that pose a barrier to effective public engagement in a practical sense. And together with this familiar medium, the photos sparked the motivation of the young to engage in this project. I guess you all heard the phrase, "One picture is worth more than 1,000 words." Well, through the use of the photos, the young participants were able to express themselves in a different manner than usual and create a different kind of understanding than, for instance, a standard meeting or an interview could do. And one of the interesting findings of this study was that none of the young participants felt that they were fully informed to have an independent opinion on the extractive industry development. None of the participants expressed a wish to take direct part in this development. And many saw themselves as spectators rather than participants. This is rather thought-provoking too, because when talking about the impacts of the development that it may have, they also mentioned the impacts on nature, the Greenlandic society in general, rather than how the extractive development might impact their own lives and how it may make a difference for their future. Nonetheless, the young participants valued the opportunity to engage and participate in a way that made sense to them, to have their voices heard on matters what they considered important. This took point of departure in what they thought and felt. They appreciated to be able to express their wants, needs, and concerns, and to share their perspectives on important matters regarding the future development of Greenland. The study is minor in many respects, and you cannot generalize, of course, but it could be an important first step towards shaking the current frame for how public participation is perceived and approached here in Greenland. It shed light on that the PP process, the public participation process, can be done in a different and more effective and meaningful way supporting sustainable development. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to an interesting discussion on how we might change the way public participation is perceived and approached in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna-Sofie, for really original research into how we can involve the youth better. I think it's a really interesting study that you found, that making things accessible using media that young people are familiar with, they're using every day, they're sitting on a bus, on their phone. It just gives them an opportunity to do something rather than trying to read lengthy texts from companies, from the government, from experts like us. I'm a lawyer, I write really, really long articles. And just making it something that they can feel they can take part in without maybe being intimidated coming into a public meeting like this one and sitting. I'm helping in my bit by forcing my students to attend this seminar, or at least listen to it after the fact. Yes, like a way is like, mandatory, but I really appreciate the work that you've done on that. So let's please open it to questions. Thank you.
It is, Anna, it's... Oh, I can't throw it all the way up there, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Christina Berg Johansen from Copenhagen Business School. Really, really cool work, so thanks for that. I'm interested in your methods, so if you could tell us a little bit more about those. So how many participated in your Facebook study? How did you get to them? And also that first thing you were talking about with where you mapped the current public participation in Greenland. How did you do that mapping? Because it's really interesting to get this kind of data, but how did you, or whoever did that, go about it? So a little bit about the methods behind. Thanks.
The methods, my study is based on a qualitative research. I had 80 participants in the Facebook group and ended up having about one-fourth of active participants, and the rest of the group were sort of lurkers, of what do you call it. They had to post at least one picture for each theme to become an active participant and be considered for that. They had to contribute for all themes. And the statistics, the percentages that I showed on the screen is from a study done by the ICC and the World Fund for Nature in 2015 by HS Analyse. So that's where I have the numbers from.
And how did you reach out to the Facebook group?
I did that by the snowballing approach.
Okay.
So I started with an initial smaller network of people, and then I reached out to their friends, because Facebook is just one big web of social networks. So it works well that way. And I had participants coming from all over Greenland. I had participants from the sea lag, from the north, the south, and from
Thank you very much. I'm Grit Nielsen from Aarhus University, Danish School of Education. I'm really interested in your point about creating kind of a mutual learning space here. So it's not just about information and then acceptance or consent, but actually how do you create a learning space in these public participation processes? And now you've looked at young people, and Facebook obviously is the way to go here. But you also said that it's male-dominated, between 60, 69 years old. So what about the rest of the population? Do you have any ideas about how to create a more common dialogue, so you're not kind of splitting people up in youngsters and then the female population, the male, but you actually create a common dialogue? How to do that? Do you have any suggestions?
That is a really good question, and perhaps we can elaborate a bit more about that and discuss that today. I don't have a final answer. My studies are initial, and there's not been a lot of research on public consultations here in Greenland yet. But I think it's important to foster mutual learning through the methods that you use, and really consider what kind of participation and engagement that the different forms provide opportunities for creating dialogue. And it's not just the companies coming into town. I've been an observer on public consultation tools in the northwest Greenland with oil companies on tour, and there were municipal representatives and government authorities and environmental experts along on that trip. And it was mostly, in my view, an information meeting rather than a dialogue meeting. They could pose questions, but it was mostly for the locals to take in information about the projects, and not so much the other way around. Of course, they gathered information on concerns about hunting prospects and how the seismic activities would affect nature and animal life. But
I have a question to the 60 to 69-year-olds, which you say was forming the majority, though qualifying to be in that particular age group. I would like to hear more this data, where does it come from? Because it doesn't, I participate in a huge amount of public meetings in Nuuk, and without making any more specific analysis, it doesn't sort of correlate with what I remember. So was it a specific area or a specific time, or could you say a little more about that, please?
Perhaps a representative from the ICC is more qualified to answer that question than I am, but I know that they have, together with the WWF, conducted numerous of their own public consultation meetings to supplement the consultations that had taken place during the time of where the oil exploration activities peaked. So I'm not quite sure.
And Eduardo, if you'll just pass it on. Yes.
Hello, Anna. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. And I think, like, at the end of the day, the outcome, we find out that there is a small amount of people participating and a small amount of local, like, young people. And my related question, because I work maybe in 60, 70 countries. I lived in Middle East and Africa and in Latin America, many places. What I find interesting here, for example, I don't know so well, the little I know about Greenland, that there is some challenge here with internet. It's quite expensive. So I don't know how much access throughout Greenland you might have that. And usually oil and gas and mining operations tend to happen not in the capital. They quite often happen in the small villages. And then goes back to the point is number one is what access to information they might have. And number two, the challenge you have in Greenland is, for example, I'm working on a project in Mozambique. It's $15 billion. So the companies, they have significant resources to send people through all over the country who tell them why this is important. Because I imagine I'm a local person. Why should I be involved? I didn't even know what is mining resources. I didn't even know what is fracture or seismic. And the only thing I know maybe that's not positive for the environment. Look, for example, United States. United States, I don't know if you're familiar with shale, which is a different way to extract gas, that actually there has a very positive impact because in United States, you own the resources. It's quite different. So I have the direct interest to come to my farm because usually I take between 5 to 10% of everything you produce. When you go into Europe to do the same thing, you just get the negative side. You just compensate for damages. So what happened to Europe? Fracking? No, no, no. We don't want that. So I think the key thing is a more broader question. Number one, how the state manage their wealth fund. Because, for example, if you go to Norway, Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, nearly $1 trillion. The help, even if you go to Norway, has one of the best paid Ph.D. in the world because they have the money from the oil and gas. So the challenge you have in countries like in Greenland, at least you have the support from Denmark to a certain extent. But how about, like, for example, go to other places where, how do you share the resources of the people and how you do this work if there is no money? Because no company is going to do so much of this work if there is no much production or no much licensing. And the government at the same time, you're such a remote, sparse country, you might not have access to internet. It gets very difficult to get people involved and to reach these people from all over the places, because until they see the value of what you're doing, how they can be involved, and the last thing, which is important, this university and others, how do I train? Because tell me, what is this thing? How does it work? Can I be a geologist? Can I be a geophysics? Can I be a lawyer? Can I be a businessman? What kind of training is involved? And that's the key thing. The government and the companies should be involved as well to train the local people to be involved. Thank you.
Was there a question?
Just comment. Just comment.
James Mitchell, Edinburgh University. My question is really about public participation, what you mean by that, because public participation comes in various shapes and forms. It comes from one end of the spectrum, which is consultation, essentially top down. We are telling the community what we're doing, right through to empowerment, allowing the community to be involved. And I'm interested not only in your very interesting piece of work, but generally what's happening in terms of participation. I have to say, from my angle in Scotland, where we do a great deal of this, 6 to 8 weeks is inadequate for anything like serious consultation, far less empowerment. So I'm interested in what is actually happening along that ladder. And secondly, a very interesting experiment that you've been running. Has there been any effort to try mini publics, citizens' juries, the various forms of deliberative democracy that are being experimented with across the world, which involves bringing experts, so-called experts, I want to stress that, along with publics and engaging over time and discussing and then trying to reach agreement? Because if you're meaningful, if you're going to have meaningful participation, then you really need to consider doing all of these things. And that takes a lot of time, it takes resources. Or is this really just, as you said earlier, a tick box exercise?
Well, Greenland has not a lot of experience with extractive development and public consultation and social impact assessment, IVAs, all these regulatives. But that's what we're going to establish, and I think that's very important to define what public participation in Greenland should be, and what's the purpose, what's the aim, what do we want to gain from this process? How much influence is it proper to involve the public? Because, of course, public participation should be for the public, but there are so many different levels to how projects works in the extractive development industry, and more influence does not necessarily provide better decisions. So it's very important to create this balance and have a dialogue on how we think it should be here in Greenland. Yeah. Did that answer your questions?
John Telling, Rambøll, Greenland. Before my question, I do have a comment on Beers, this 60 to 69-year-old. I participated in public meetings in the north, and I do recognize it in the villages, because the consultation meetings are during the day, where the males are out fishing. So in the villages, I do recognize it. In towns, no, it's different. For your Facebook group, I'm just curious, language, was it both Greenlandic and Danish, or was it, what language did you use?
It was both in Greenlandic and Danish, and everyone was encouraged to participate in the language that they felt most comfortable using. So all information was provided in both languages, and it was a mix.
Josefine Nyman from Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. It's just a comment to this public participation and the extractive industry. It's true that there may not be that much experience, but why not draw upon some of the experiences from other kinds of projects? I'm thinking about Alcoa project that was on the table very much about 10 years ago, and in that project, it kind of developed a way of doing public consultations, public participations by introductions and also coffee table discussions. And it was a returning thing for 4 years maybe, that a group of people came back to the same place, the same town, the same village in the area of interest, and spent quite a lot of time not just presenting, but actually discussing and talking with people. And by having a coffee table thing after maybe a presentation, it made the group smaller, and it encouraged people actually to engage in this discussion. And that work somehow has been forgotten in the last few years. And I think it's a shame, because it was a development that actually ended up with some really good discussions and involvement.
What was the project?
Alcoa's alumina smelter thing that may or may not still be around.
So maybe back to the question of the need of evaluation of the projects that we already had.
And I think, just to add, that it's important to consider the specific context and how you might best provide information and create a space for input and making people feel comfortable. And that's also one of the things that the oil companies I was traveling with in Northern Greenland experienced, that it was very important to establish this sphere where people felt comfortable speaking their mind, and also relating to Biwa and you. It's what did I want to say? Sorry.
I'm having trouble.
I think we'll just move on to the
Yes, I have a question. I'm a student at Social Sciences here at Ilisimatusarfik, and I have a question whether if you found out which information is presented at their public participation meetings by their companies, or perhaps anyone in the room knows more about it? Is it more technical, or is it suitable for the civil society, for example, one young person or non-expert on extractive industries, or have you come across that?
From my perspective and observations, it's primarily about the exploration activities, for example, the seismic activities, how it works, what are the effects, and also opportunities for training and education and jobs, job prospects in the industry.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit, because I know you did actually do a study where you compared perceptions of what the success was, the expectations for success between different stakeholders in the initial meetings.
In regards to information.
So what the companies wanted out of the meeting, the public and the government.
Yeah. My expectation was initially that the companies just wanted a tick in the box. But it wasn't like that, for instance. That's one perception of public participation on my own, and how I perceive the different stakeholders and how they perceive each other. That is very different.
But I remember also that you talked about how, you know, in relation to what was just asked about, how the public would expect to hear about what's in it for me and what are the opportunities for me. What the companies would inform about was about how do we perform and how safe is our, you know, activities.
Yes.
For the spotlight.
Of course, they wanted the positive perception about the projects, but it's important to both come forward with negative impacts as well.
Emma?
Do you want to follow up?
Can I elaborate a bit about what you say? Because I have also been a part of some of these public consultation meetings for some of the mining projects. I think you're right, the perception is very different, but we try to, we want to get people's support for this, because essentially they're going to work in these projects. So they have to be engaged and be part of it, and we try to explain what is going to happen, and we do have independent advisors that also explain about the more difficult aspects, or what we should call it, the more negative aspects. We do have people from here, from the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, that participate and talk about some of the environmental impacts of it. So I think we can always do better. It's just to explain that we already have this in place. So we don't just have a company saying all the great things, we also have other people to present the more negative aspects of it.
I think some of how the consultation process seemed to me was that there is a lack of trust in government authorities and all companies. The government authorities, they don't trust them to manage the projects well, to create the most benefit for the Greenlandic society. And of course there is something to work on there, but also there is a sense of the companies coming in here just dragging money out of Greenland as much as possible. But of course the companies are here to make money, otherwise they wouldn't be here. But we need to, they have a wish to create positive benefits for the Greenlandic society as well. If they're given the opportunity, they will do so. And I think it's also important to have legislative guidelines that sets this minimum as we have and is establishing continuously.
Wilson, an independent researcher and consultant from the UK, and thank you for this really interesting presentation. It's a really important aspect of consultation to be able to reach particular interest groups and communities and how to reach those. And in the UK, social media is one of those areas that has been explored a lot, and people are constantly thinking how to explore social media opportunities. But equally, even in the UK, there are people who don't have access to the internet. My dad, for instance, never uses the internet and wouldn't know how to. So I'm wondering, in fact, it was possibly a question that Edgardo fitted into his long commentary. What is the level of access to the internet throughout Greenland? Clearly, a lot of people do have access, and young people, it's a favoured sort of use. But what are the other, how extensive is that? And can you suggest some other ways of reaching different people? But I also think this is a really good way of pointing out the need for strategies for reaching people in public consultation and not just having meetings. So thank you for bringing this into the debate.
The internet accessibility differ a lot here in Greenland. So social media might not be the best tool to use in any context. And of course, you have to consider some of the various other methods that could be applied. For instance, the workshop discussions that were mentioned from the Occult project over there. So I think it's important, again, to emphasize that public participation should be context specific. So you have to adapt the forms and approach and methods to the target group that you want to reach. For instance, it could be interesting to see how do you get more women involved in the discussions in the smaller settlements, because as you mentioned, the meeting attendance is different in the larger cities compared to the smaller settlements and villages. And maybe it's a cultural thing where men are perhaps higher in the hierarchy, and the elders are allowed to speak their opinion on behalf of the local communities. But I'm not an expert on that, so that's just a sense that I got from the observations.
Kisa Torsø from the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and it might more be a comment, but I think what is also I can hear is that we have to talk about the social license to operate. I think a lot of the things that we are saying is that the companies should be aware of how to engage the people, and we had a workshop up here 2 months ago where we discussed it a lot, and we also discussed the kind of form that the information was given to the public, and I think that we also elaborated a bit on the public hearings that was done about the Kvanefjell mining project, and what we kind of agreed and discussed a lot was that the communication form from the companies is very important, and also that the companies should engage really early in trying to get the social license to operate. And I think it's important for the companies, but also from the government and the municipalities, that we take these kind of discussions, and also I think one of the things is that it often becomes very complicated, and there's a lot of people that are not able to understand all the terms and all the things that are discussed, and we have to think about ways to make sure that people can actually understand what is saying. And that wasn't actually a question, just a comment. Yeah.
Thank you. Just before I let Anna-Sofie go, I'd really like to ask a question about...
Rachel, we have one more.
Yes.
Final.
Sorry. Okay, if I can just ask this and then we'll turn it over. I wanted to ask about the young people that you did get involved in Facebook. You said they started by saying, I'm not informed, I can't have an opinion because I don't know enough. At the end of your experiment on Facebook, did they have more confidence? Did you find the views getting stronger, more confidence in expressing an opinion? Did they feel more informed? Did they indicate they might actually be willing to go to a public meeting and take part in the future? So could we think of this as even a confidence building to then bring people that otherwise wouldn't be engaged into the more formal processes?
I did have an opportunity to engage in more in-depth discussions with some of the participants that was involved in my project. But again, they didn't feel confident about having an opinion, independent opinion on the matter. And it didn't exactly grow, but this is an initial study, and there's a lot to follow up on, and I would love to have the chance to do some more studies on how, well, with the same participants, and try to get a more, create a more thorough understanding for them for what the extractive development in Greenland is and what it means and how it might affect their lives, and then see how they reflect upon that. Yeah.
You just asked the exact question I was going to.
I'll take this then.
Thanks very much, Anna-Sofie. We may have